profesor de Derecho Privado, que es el caso de Florian Möslein, puede abarcar, como abarca Florian Möslein, common law and other areas of commercial law. Then he's a professor, catedrático of private law, pero es compañero nuestro. That's good for multidisciplinarity, which is very good for an application of a research project. Eso es muy bueno para la multidisciplinaridad, porque hoy día se pide eso. It's very good because he is one of our colleagues. ¿No? And nevertheless, no obstante, the knowledge that he has on private law is very good for areas like that, which are more general, more teoría del derecho, que es el área de Patricia Santos, por ejemplo, ¿no? y que ya escribió en este libro sobre un capítulo sobre ideas genéricas, ¿no? Bien, está en Marburg University y le conocí a través de una solicitud, I get to know Florian through an application of a research project in the European Union, which wasn't successful, no fue exitoso, but there was a successful fruit, which was the acquaintance with Florian, ¿no? El que ahora conozco.
Even more important.
Y entonces luego hemos estado pues, en el libro de Hanevir Mose y estamos ahora en este proyecto y él nos va a hablar sobre social and solidarity based enterprises, empresas con enfoque social e incluso solidario. Él va a exponer estas ideas en el Parlamento de Europa, en the European Parliament. He's going to give this talk. We are the guinea pigs, nosotros somos los conejillos de Indias que van a permitir pues, estas ideas que van a ser expuestas en ese ámbito, pues ser expuestas por una primera ocasión. Thank you very much, Florian. And
thank you so much for the kind introduction. Sorry for remaining seated. I know it is impolite, but otherwise the camera won't catch me. And thanks for the occasion. It won't be only to take a chance to try what I'm going to present in the European Parliament next week, but I also give this presentation because I think it has much to do with our project. It has much to do with this equilibrium of corporate governance that you just presented. Even though the occasion to discuss is focused on a very specific corporate form, which might be called European Statute for Social and Solidarity-Based Enterprises. That's a report that has been delivered by the European Parliament recently, written by an Italian colleague, and proposing a new corporate form specifically directed at social enterprises. And even though it's a specific corporate form, I think we can learn a lot for general corporate law as well, as we will see in a minute. Now, what is social entrepreneurship? I think there are many different forms. Could you just, every time I tell you, or you just give me this?
Yes.
So if you just push the button 5 times, will be nothing. So there are many different forms of social social enterprises, and most of them do not really fit in our traditional picture that we have. It's not feeding poor people, but it's producing jackets, it's producing ice cream, or it's producing energy, and all those firms have in common that they are like ordinary business firms. They're producing products, selling them at market prices, but at the same time they follow a social purpose, and they want to do something better for the environment, or for the workers, or for the general good. So the specific thing here is that we really have a mixture of long-term sustainability, social, ecological orientation, and profit-making businesses at the same time. And that is, I think, something very specific. And I come to the next slide. And what we need to discuss is whether we need a specific regulation for these new type of companies. In the US, the key word is profit and purpose, so companies combining profit making and having a more general purpose, and people also talk about the fourth sector, So an additional sector in addition to private, public, and traditional social enterprises. The question for us is, do we need to regulate them? Do we need to provide a specific corporate law regime for such companies? Or are the existing company forms suitable to host these new kinds of companies? Now, the problem with the traditional corporate form is that, as we have seen, at least in some countries, in some jurisdictions, corporations are still very much shareholder focused, shareholder value oriented, in particular in the US, but also in some European countries. And indeed, that was the main driving force behind the introduction of so-called benefit corporations in the US, a special form of companies that are not as much focused on the shareholder value as US corporations in general. Now in Europe, we have, of course, many different corporate laws. We have many different approaches. And the question really is whether European corporate laws are flexible enough for this type of companies, giving managers enough discretion, or at least allowing shareholders to introduce respective clauses in the articles of associations to allow for social entrepreneurship. However, introducing special articles is difficult because once the company is taken over, the new acquirer might change the articles. And that was, by the way, the case in Ben & Jerry's, this ice cream company. And that was an additional impetus for introducing benefit corporations. Now, flexibility in company law and flexibility to allow for social purposes is one argument. But the other one is signaling effects. Companies who opt into a special regime can show their customers, their shareholders, that they are good companies. Like Fair Trade Cafe, you can have good companies, and you can show it by choosing a specific corporate regime. Now, if for these reasons we agree that we need a specific regulation, we still have another question, which is, at what level do we need regulation? Do we need regulation at member states level, or do we need a regulation at European level? And this report has shown that a large number of member states have already introduced specific corporate forms. 18 member states have something at least similar. But these new forms are very different. Some are cooperative, some are corporations. Some are not specific corporate forms, but only qualifications of existing corporate forms. So the landscape of social enterprises is very different across Europe. However, different legal regimes in different member states is not an argument for the European Union to regulate. As we all know, we need at least some cross-border relevance. And that is a crucial question here, because many social enterprises are small, local or regional enterprises, and there's no element of cross-border relevance here. Therefore, I would propose that the European Union does not focus on small cooperatives, but on larger, capital market-oriented social enterprises. We will come back to the question whether that is something that exists. But this would comply with the general approach of company law harmonization in the European Union, which is always focused on larger companies. It would also interact with existing European rules on sustainability in the corporate field, like the recent directive on disclosure of non-financial information, which is also only applicable to larger companies, and also the regulation on USEF on sustainable investments in funds. So, at least in part, we should regulate social enterprises at the European level, but how should we regulate them? How should we tailor regulation on social enterprises? Well, as I have already argued, I would opt for a European regulation on social enterprise corporations and leave the cooperatives to the national legislators. And I would like to bring forward an additional proposal. Experience has shown that it is difficult to introduce new corporate forms. There have been many different proposals, but most of them have not succeeded. And therefore, I would rather argue not to introduce a new corporate form, but to introduce a kind of qualification of existing corporate forms. And I would like to abbreviate it with the SE in square, which means a social enterprise type of the Société Européenne. So the abbreviation is the same, and we can just use SE in square. What does SE in square mean? Well, I would rather argue for a qualification regime similar to what we have in the US, where we have these benefit corporations as specific corporate forms, but only at state level. And we have, in addition to that, a certification regime, which is called B Corp. So one should not confound the two. And B Corp is a certification regime. So it's not a special corporate form, but it's just a kind of label that companies can use when they comply with certain standards of sustainability and social orientation. And this certification regime would be enough for the signaling effect. We don't need any new corporate form to have this effect. But I think it's important to have a specific European regime, because otherwise the existing US regime would be used also for European firms, and then we have like a worldwide US standard. It might make sense to discuss to have an alternative regime in Europe for this purpose. Whether we need, in addition to this certification regime, a specific corporate form is a question that depends on general corporate law. And it's also a question for comparative lawyers who need to find out whether the existing SE regimes in various member countries are flexible enough to host social enterprises, whether they allow for such balancing of social interests and interests of the shareholders. So I think this proposal and the project we are talking about fits very well together. And let me sum up and finish with the last slide. I had mentioned that I opt for regulating capital market oriented social enterprises, and I also mentioned this might seem as two worlds apart, two different things. But in fact, there are many social enterprises attracting investors, and the key word is impact investment. There are many responsible investors who want not only to increase the value of their investment, but also to invest in investments that are socially beneficial. And various specific stock exchanges have come up, one in Madrid, La Bolsa Social, but also the Social Stock Exchange in London. And more recently, 3 weeks ago, I think, the first benefit corporation has been listed on the Nasdaq, Laureate, an education company. And so we see increasingly social enterprises being listed and being oriented versus the capital market. And that, I think, is an additional argument for tailoring the regulation as I have opposed. Many thanks.
Thank you very much.
Looking forward to